Okay, welcome everybody. This will be episode 9, I think, for the open source podcast, or episode 8. I got that wrong. But I am joined by one of my good country friends. It's few and far in between to find some people with the same Western kind of background in open source. But Hart Montgomery, CTO of the Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust. Hi, Hart. How you doing?
Hey, Christian. I'm doing well, thanks. How are you today?
Doing great. I have to personally thank you too, because you're kind of the catalyst for my understanding in open source. So when we sat down I, I think you were there for the barbecue, were you not? It was like 3 or 4 hours. I was just me and Johnny and you talking.
Yeah, we've definitely talked for a while, but you're far too kind in saying I'm the catalyst for you understanding open source.
Well, you are. You helped pioneer a lot of the stuff and did it without me even being a member of LF, just because you're a natural uh, gift giver of your knowledge and wisdom. Maybe I'm putting you on a high pedestal, but
You're,
to
you're,
me, you're there. Okay.
you're much too kind, Christian.
Well, I did want to start this process off. Why don't you introduce yourself, explain how you got into open source, and how did you end up, of all things, in the blockchain, crypto, Hyperledger, and that wonderful journey?
Absolutely. So great question. So I'll have to go pretty far back to do this. Um, you know, as I was finishing up undergrad, I, didn't really know what I wanted to do. So I loved computer science and, particularly the more mathematical aspects of it. So I thought, why not go to grad school? So I was lucky enough to get into Stanford, and so I wanted to do a CS PhD there in something theoretical. I met Dan Bonet, and I was captivated by cryptography. Of course, Dan is amazing, and I was extremely lucky to have the opportunity to do my PhD under him. And yeah, when you meet Dan, it's hard not to be excited by cryptography. So I was, super excited by that. I'll claim it's the most practical the most practical thing you can do while still working on math. So it's got that, angle for it. So that's how I got into cryptography, and I actually got into blockchain a little bit when I was in grad school. So I believe I gave the first Bitcoin talk at Stanford. Don't exactly recall when, but it was a Stanford crypto group reading group. Bitcoin was very inexpensive, and I believe people still have emails from me telling them not to buy Bitcoin at very cheap prices. So please don't take investment advice from me. That one gets brought up on occasion. But yeah, so I got into that, pretty early. So I was actually into, cryptography and blockchain, sort of before I got into open source. After grad school, I went to work for Fujitsu at Fujitsu Research, which I had a lot of fun doing. And I, did a lot of blockchain stuff there. We at Fujitsu got, heavily involved. We were, did a lot of cryptography. Fujitsu still does a lot of stuff in blockchain and everything like that. And obviously, one big aspect of that is open source. It's hard to work in the blockchain space or the cryptography space without a significant open source presence. So I got more into that. I learned more about that. It was really a trial by fire. I kind of got thrown into it. And in some of the public communities, particularly in the Linux Foundation, like Hyperledger. But I had a lot of great people to talk to. So like Brian Behlendorf, obviously. And other people like Chris Ferris from IBM who are really helpful. And so I learned a lot about that. And then eventually, a role opened up at the Linux Foundation. I, thought it would be really exciting to work more directly on open source and have that freedom. So I took it, and that's how I ended up at the Linux Foundation.
Oh, that's really cool.
A bit longer than you probably wanted, but
no, it's funny because I was joking with somebody the other day. Yeah, when you're like majoring in math, most of the times it's just going back to the institution you studied for a career. But blockchain kind of opens more doors that way, which
absolutely.
is really cool. And I think that's one of the aspects I like it is at least even in some of the functional programming languages themselves, everything is verifiable back to math equations. But so tell me about your journey with Hyperledger now becoming the LF Decentralized Trust. Because y'all gained a lot of interest. I ran into you at the Open Source Summit with Johnny was it 4 years ago now?
Yeah, it was a while ago.
Yeah, I can't remember, but it was the only talk. Like we were the anonymous Cardano people there, just to kind of learn before we did our whole Voltaire governance phase. But you were the only person talking Web3, and it was on ledgers. And I thought it was cool. And then I was like, wow, there's a lack of exposure here. And I know y'all pushed heavily to at least get that marketing going across and inclusion factors.
Yeah. I mean, when Hyperledger was started, it was very focused on permission blockchain and sort of, very narrow. And this was just because the institutions of the day were sort of unwilling to touch anything public blockchain. If you go back to 2015 or 2016, like you couldn't mention Ethereum in a bank or a financial institution. It would be like the people throwing the guy out of the window meme. So, obviously that's changed a lot, and we're really excited about that. But really, we had a lot of people that wanted to contribute projects that were much broader than something that would be associated with Hyperledger, right? Even things that were sort of outside of the blockchain space, but definitely well within the decentralized, trust landscape, right? Some examples are, we have a really cool project called Loch Ness, which was contributed by the company Defense, which is about, threshold cryptography and some threshold MPC applications. People do use it with blockchain, but you don't have to, right? It's a really nice decentralization technology. We have, we're starting to get projects on zero knowledge and snarks and, a lot of digital identity stuff, which I think is really important. So we've really just seen a broadening of the scope, and we had all these people that said, well, we want to, work with you and contribute all these projects that weren't necessarily ledgers. So we felt like we needed to broaden the scope of the project, and that's what we did.
Oh, it was a wonderful game changer, I would say, because y'all kind of also positioned yourself as a neutral nexus to help intersect most of these needs. But going back to what you're saying about permission chains, I mean, coming from the permissionless side in Cardano, and then we have even more of an ethos about, I don't want to say we have all the anarchist degens, but they all want to redo the voting systems of the world and governments and topple things that way, which is its own niche. But yeah, trying to sell that to a commercial enterprise or a system of banks is a complete no-go. But I think that's changed quite a bit now.
It's changed quite a bit. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I was at the Bank of International Settlements Innovation Week, talking about all this stuff. That's if you're not familiar with that, that's sort of the central bank of central banks. So, even the most conservative folks in finance are investigating and interested in the technology. Obviously, the central banks, have they're required to do things like KYC and AML and a bunch of other stuff that wouldn't fly in the public blockchain world. But if the technology is the same and the rails are the same, then it could really revolutionize finance.
100%. Well, and I think regulation is kind of taking that into perspective nowadays, at least in the US, which is nice to see for a change. But to that too, I did want to touch on the digital identity, because I do think also with the rise of AI and where data is coming from, data sovereignty has become an issue, and what you're willing to give up when it comes to your digital identity and data ownership. And so how do you see digital identity kind of positioning itself now to become like public infrastructure in technology?
This is a great question. So I've frequently refer to myself as a digital identity maximalist. I don't refer to myself as a maximalist of too many things, but I'm a big believer that digital identity is going to be everywhere, and it has to be everywhere. Particularly in a world where we have AI everywhere, right? Everything is going to be run with an AI agent, right? My phone is going to have an agent doing something. It's going to be talking with, my bank's agent or the Amazon agent or whatever agent is buying stuff. So how do I know I'm talking to the right person, right? Or that something has the right permissions to interact, right? It's got to be digital identity, right? Social media, right? It's going to just completely fall apart in the long run, I think, unless I have some verification that a post is done by a person, or at least a person has authorized their AI to make some post, right? It's just going to be everywhere. So particularly with things like adversarial AI, right? If you're familiar with this,
yeah,
it's very easy to trick agents. The attackers definitely have the advantage. So if I have an agent that's buying something or doing something or spending money, right? I really need to trust whoever it's buying from, right? I need to trust that they're not manipulating their data or their listing so that my agent isn't being tricked, right? So there's got to be this sort of huge trust infrastructure. And this even gets into stuff we're doing at the Linux Foundation, right? Where we have all these software supply chain attacks that are very tricky and difficult to deal with. And one of the ways that we're proposing that we deal with this is essentially a zero knowledge based reputation system. So that you can attest as a maintainer that you are credible, you're a real person. Maybe you even work for an employer off some known list. But doing that in zero knowledge so you don't hurt your privacy.
Well, and just for the beginners, can you summarily explain what zero knowledge is and how it applies to these kind of data transactions?
Yeah, sure. Technically it's a little bit tricky to explain, right?
There's a bunch of equations with it, right?
Well, we have to start by defining an NP language, right? But no, basically a zero knowledge proof is a way to prove a statement without actually revealing why the statement is true, I'll say. So basically the most common application in blockchain is if I have a digital signature on something signed by a particular party, I can prove that I have this signature without revealing the signature itself. And I can even prove aspects of the signature, right? So the easiest way to think about the problem that zero knowledge proofs solve is, let's say you're the DMV and you give me a driver's license, right? And it's a digital driver's license. So what is it? It's a signature, right, of all my stuff that goes into the driver's license, right? Name, address, age, whatever, under your public key, right? And then what I can do with the zero knowledge proof is I can convince you that, I have a valid driver's license from the DMV and I am, over 21, so I can go to the bar without revealing all the other information on my driver's license. So it's this kind of like selective disclosure application.
I got you. Basically, when the guy is trying to see if you're old enough to buy alcohol, it just gives a check mark that you are without revealing anything else.
Exactly. That's the right abstraction to think about
Cool.
without going too much into the details.
Yeah. Well, and I think I think IOG gave y'all, it was a Tala Prism, right? Which became Identis.
Yep.
I think they have their own solution also towards this too. I don't know if it's ZK based, is it?
Yes.
Or okay.
So cool. It's not general ZK based, but it is ZK based.
Tied into it, yeah.
Yeah.
So how do you see the usability and privacy on that against geographic regions too? I know you've done a lot of talks abroad, and LF's kind of opened up different chapters. So I'm interested how geographically opinions are towards these kind of standards.
Well, standards are always tricky. So people have different ways of doing things. That being said, people worldwide are pretty much opening up to this idea. So if you look at the European rules, right, like the definitions for the EUDI wallet and what that requires, the law basically requires them to use pretty strong anonymous credentials, which would require this kind of zero knowledge identity. If you look at what's happening in India, Aadhaar itself is not privacy preserving, but a lot of the next generation solutions for digital identity in India, so things like DigiYatra, which is a travel credential system. It's how you get into the airport in India. It's becoming more and more popular. Tens of. Last time I checked, they had something like 50 million trips done with it. It's probably significantly larger than that now. But that also uses strong ZK-based anonymous credentials. So it's getting adopted there too. And the next generation of systems like MOSIP will probably use it.
That's cool.
East Asia too. People are starting to explore these. Canada has been a big pioneer in digital identity and privacy. You can go look at the British Columbia Digital Trust Office and see all the stuff they have. Lots of different things, everything from physical mining to legal credentials. You can use privacy preserving, zero knowledge based tools to do things. I love the physical mining example because it turns out that mining credentials and rights are actually quite complicated, and it makes perfect sense to have this kind of zero knowledge credential set up for. But it's always really funny when they go to blockchain conferences because they have to explain to people that they're like physical miners and not blockchain miners.
That is funny. Yeah, that's one of a million running. So to that point too, I know the other big thing that's coming around is the topic of tokenization. If it can be tokenized, it will be tokenized. Now, with RWAs, what's your experience with that, where the technology is going? I haven't dabbled too much into this yet, but I know I'm starting to be asked questions myself about applications for this.
Yeah, I mean, it's moving forward. We'll get there eventually. I do believe that pretty much everything will be tokenized. It's just a more efficient way to handle financial markets. I think many people believe in this, and there are just some outstanding things like privacy, KYC, AML, and legal regulations that sort of have to be clarified before sort of everything is run in sort of a tokenized way.
Yeah.
Even with the Genius Act, which is a great step forward for legal clarity, there's still some corner cases. They're getting ironed out. I'm confident we'll get there. But financial firms are conservative, and they often don't have the technical expertise, particularly in leadership positions, that it would take to move some of this stuff forward quickly.
Yeah, I can see that. Well, and then political climates, the SEC has a new take every 4 years anyway, typically. So regulations are very slow. Well, I think what's that adage like with the AI example? The US innovates it, Europe regulates it, China copies it, makes it cheaper.
I don't think that's necessarily correct. I mean, there's a lot of innovation also going on in Europe and China.
Yeah. It's very much an oversimplification, I'd say. But yeah. Well, I did want to delve into also decentralized governance. I know me and you have talked lengths to this before, especially with open source sustainability as a factor. Cardano has their own kind of pioneer piece, but I won't fully go there. Y'all recently did help pioneer the first open source neutral hub for Hedera. basically a whole chain that donated its codes to the Linux Foundation. Can you kind of tell us about that journey, how conversations went, and how they formulated their governance?
Yeah, absolutely. We maintain the philosophy that you're sort of only as decentralized as your weakest link, right? If you have a single, centralized organization or an organization that's controlled by one person that can, arbitrarily edit the code of a blockchain or make other decisions like that, you're not really decentralized. So the Hedera people were very aware of this, and they wanted to do their best to achieve true centralization and also just grow the community. So that's why they decided to contribute their code base to the LF under a new project called Hyro. And one thing that we really see and we really like with this is the separation of the governance of the code base and the blockchain. This is particularly true when your code base might get reused across lots of different applications, right? So, Hedera, right? The Hyro code base has gotten reused in other things like HashSphere, a bunch of other places. People are picking up the consensus algorithm. And we see this much more widely in something like Besu, which is used, it's obviously like 15 to 20% of Ethereum mainnet, but it's also used on L2s. It's used in a bunch of permission chains, and it's really all over the place, right? So just this separation of network governance and code governance is really important, particularly if the code is going to be used in multiple different networks or projects, as we've seen. So that's one thing that I think the Hyro governance gets completely right. And obviously there's overlap, right? There are a ton of people that are working on the Hedera blockchain that are also working on Hyro. But obviously the number of people that started working on Hyro, when Hyro started, it was 100% of Hedera people, right? And that's gone down considerably. And you can, go check it out on our LFX platform. One of the things we really believe in at the Linux Foundation is as much transparency as we can possibly provide. So, we want to be able to show you, the best that we can, who's contributing to a project, how much are they contributing. We want people to be able to see the risks of adopting a code base, right? And one of the risks is centralization, right? If one company is dominant over an open source code base, that can be problematic for the long-term health and future of the code base, right? Because what if that company decides to go away? This is something that blockchain people really understand well, which is great. It can be harder to convince like traditional corporate people of this, but blockchain people are usually like, well, yeah, it absolutely makes sense that you don't want one entity dominating a code base. And that, if we go to the sort of natural conclusion, this is what the Linux Foundation serves to do, right? The whole point of the Linux Foundation is to be a place where companies can, and individuals and others, can collaborate on open source development in a decentralized and neutral way.
Yeah, well, and I think it's highlighting, and like you're saying, something that's hard. I was meeting some people from my church for dinner one time, and one of them's in his 70s asking me, oh, you do crypto, how do you explain it? And you're like, how do you summarize setting up an entire digital nation with its own constitution, currency, treasury, all that fun stuff within 5 minutes without him saying bleh and walking away? So it's a lot of hard conversations. It comes naturally for us, but that's where things like this matter so much. And that's why I appreciate Hedera's approach to that with Hyro, because you are kind of separating church and state, and that you have that neutral vendor piece. I know Cardano tried that. I don't know the full story, but we ended up doing something similar with Intersect, trying to be that piece here. And we're ensuring that there is no central dominant power and working on that journey. But it's cool that Hyro finally graduated after a year, so I'm assuming they achieved that whole milestone.
Yeah, they've got a bunch of different people working on it. It's always fun to just look and just be like, wait, that person or this company has, made contributions, some surprising people. So, you go check it out and see. Yeah, it's really interesting, and yeah, they've done a good job.
Yeah, which shout out also, because I think Baturja is also consulting with them. They have a really good radar report. I'm trying to get something similar for Cardano specifically, but it does highlight the unique factors about how Hedera has their focus in Cardano, and we're kind of outliers from the other ecosystems building, in the sense of like the ethos of how open source collaboration works. So, yeah, quick
Yeah,
shout out.
Even in the blockchain space, a lot of people, a lot of people got into blockchain without having a lot of, open source background. So, we still explain to people how things work. People are generally very supportive. A lot of it is just like a knowledge thing. And, I frequently go around giving like lessons learned talks to folks, just what we've learned at the Linux Foundation about what works and what doesn't work, over like, 25 years at this point of open source code. I mean, one of the biggest pitfalls we see is often people want to use GPL as a license. It's sort of like, oh, GPL is, the natural thought is, well, it will grow the community because it forces people to contribute back, right? If you're just, sort of looking at it, you might think that. When unfortunately, it's the opposite. Most people will want to use your open source code or project in something, production related or work related. And having that GPL restriction will make it very hard for them to do so. And thus they just won't use your code.
Yeah, it's mostly downstream contribution versus upstream. So very much that. Which, to highlight, case in point, you giving lectures, here I am as a result. But what would you say outside of the GPL are like the two biggest hurdles people need to recognize when it comes from the Web3 background with Web2 open source best practice?
Oh, that's a good question. A lot of the things I would say are still just sort of particular to general open source, not just Web3. There's the whole sort of basic idea that you can do often a lot better with collaboration than you can by yourself. So people in many cases are very afraid to give up their code base or make it open or neutral, right? And it's sort of this thing, well, there's this pie of profit or opportunity or whatever that can be made from this. And if I open it up to other people, like they're going to be taking a piece of the pie. But the sort of idea is if you do a good job, you can, grow the size of the pie, so to speak. So even though you don't have the whole pie anymore, the pie is much bigger and it more than compensates for that. So this kind of analogy, sort of the reason why to fully open source stuff, I would say still applies. We see a lot of proprietary open source in Web3. So I think, pretty much everyone believes that the code should be visible, right? This is sort of a table stakes for Web3, right? No one is going to do a totally closed source Web3 application. It's just not credible. Where we sort of see more resistance is sort of the full open governance, right? So the full open source. And there are degrees, right? I like to give a talk where there are different things, right? There's closed source, there's sort of proprietary open source, which is like a BSL model. There's sort of a benevolent dictator model, right? And then there's full open source. And you kind of have the continuum. And pretty much everybody in Web3 has made it, part of the way on the continuum, but it's less common where people have gone to sort of full open governance models.
Yeah, 100%. I think that was the first point. So what would be a second sticking point?
For For which part of this continuum? I'll ask a clarifying question.
Well, the first question was the sticking points for open source adoption in general. And I think this kind of touches the several different models related to governance and the transition to fully open source. So I would clarify a second piece stemming from that, because I see, at least in our ecosystem, fully open source is kind of the mandate, I would say, especially when you, Cardano is unique in that animal that if you want to get treasury funding, you need to be like even release the salaries of your employees sometimes is kind of a mandate, which I'd say is some privacy things there. But benevolent dictator models and the BSL approaches, would love your thoughts on that, pros and cons. Because we were approached in the beginning with a BSL with our open source committee, and we shot that down because the promise that we'll go open source in 10 years, give or take, doesn't really have an ROI if you're looking for investment up front. And it's not, I would argue, it's not freely open source, but
yeah, you're technically right. So BSL is technically not an open source license. It is a software license, but it is not an open source license. The reason to do BSL is if you want to, for whatever reason, protect your code, but you want others to be able to look at it and check it, right?
yeah.
We see people, particularly, who consider themselves like research organizations who are, trying to push the cutting edge. And they say, well, we want to pay for our research, so we're going to sort of, make our code BSL, so people can see what we're doing, and maybe we'll allow academics to use it, but we won't allow, others to use it. And there are some blockchain companies that have very complicated BSL licenses where, everything from you can only use this if you're building on our network to, you can use this for anything as long as you're not directly competing with us. But these kinds of licenses generally hinder adoption, right? There's always a calculation of how do I make the most money. If I could tell you this, I would, be an extremely rich, VC or investor. So it's obviously a case by case thing. But if you're shooting for adoption, then you definitely don't want to go with this license. It's always a trade-off. The copyleft licenses like GPL, I think these days, and again, I'll disclaim, I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. Consult a lawyer for licensing questions. The copyleft licenses I see is typically the worst of both worlds. It hinders adoption like a BSL license, but other people can, in theory, use it. I'm laughing. Someone did present a good use of the GPL license. It was because he was working for a startup, and the startup was failing, and he wanted to use the code in his next startup without restrictions. And so this person basically sort of, but it's, I don't
If I'm not mistaken, wasn't there a lawsuit on this or something?
I wouldn't be surprised.
Okay, I think it was a case study when I was learning about that. Yeah.
But there are a lot of, encumbrances that can happen with GPL. It doesn't let you grow your community like a permission, or I'm sorry, like like Apache or MIT or other permissive licenses.
Completely. Well, I'd say anything that you limits the innovation or creation kind of gets rid of the whole open source culture to begin with. And at that point, it's becoming a monetization game, which most of the open source experience I pull from comes from actually modding games. So Skyrim, even though they still pretty much have a proprietary thing on it, unless you collaborate with them to make money on your mods, they did open source under something, the creation engine. So people can actually go and manipulate the game, and there's like 1 billion some downloads, give or take.
And that's why people still play the game today. Yeah.
Yeah, it keeps it alive. I mean, I'm still addicted to it. It's been 15 years. No, yeah, 15 years since Skyrim came out. And I was playing Oblivion before that. Just having a Nissan GTR meshed over a horse that gallops. It's a fun little. Anyway, but that's kind of the. If you want something to survive even product-wise, you got to keep that in mind. But to your point, I did want to touch base back towards. Where was I going with this? Security practices also with projects. So I know, and this has to do with project health, and it's been something we've been learning how to do. And I know y'all already have kind of a graded structure for how you assess projects, but I've been told the Open Source Security Foundation scorecard is kind of the de facto standard. Anything from that, not so much. So I was trying to see your thoughts too, because I'm trying to navigate this right now where I'm assessing our own internal projects, and we have one designated towards technical infrastructure, one towards community health, and then another towards like governance or documentation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a long conversation. We could talk hours about this. You know, the scorecard and other OpenSSF tools are great. They're not particularly deep always, but they're great for making sure projects have the right tools in place, right? So you can think of it as a checklist, like, you know, and it's great just, you know, going through your own code and your own projects just to check off everything. You know, maybe there's something you forgot. You know, even experienced people will sometimes forget things on occasion, like, oh, I didn't set this up, I need to set this up, kind of thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a great baseline. You know, it's obviously not a perfect indicator of whether code is secure or not, but it's a good indicator of like, does this open source project or does this project have the tools in place to be secure? And that's what it kind of that's what it shoots for.
Like, right? A risk mitigation, yeah.
And it's a great, you know, learning experience too for folks that aren't as experienced in security to kind of go through this and see, you know, this is what I need to be looking at. This is what I need to be doing. And there's a bunch of stuff coming on that front. The other thing that's really popular these days are SBOMs, or software bill of materials. If people aren't familiar, most modern software, even proprietary software, is essentially an open source sausage. We've seen a number of studies recently, and you can go look at these on the Linux Foundation research page, if you like, about what projects are doing with open source software. And there's a recent one that looked at, I want to say, like 1,500 popular, you know, open and closed projects. Something like 90% of the code on average was open source in all of these, right? So basically, you know, people are starting with some kind of like open source framework. They're, you know, using different open source libraries to solve problems, and then they're just writing like the connective tissue sort of between these. And that's the only thing they're writing by hand. So, you know, when you have code that looks like this, and whether you're open or closed source, this is what your code is looking like these days. Potentially big software supply chain issues, right? If you have a dependency that's critical, and something happens there, then that could be a big security issue, right? And so what you need to do is you need to document all your dependencies, and, you know, good SBOM software will notify you, right? If you have an SBOM, they'll say, aha, one of your dependencies has a bug, you need to do something, right? So this is really important for security, and especially since we've seen a lot of these supply chain attacks where attackers are taking over weak points in the supply chain, right? There's the famous XKCD comic with all modern software held up by this little pillar. That is far more true than most people believe. This is absolutely a critical thing to do. And I've done a number of sort of manual reviews of supply chain dependencies after going through an SBOM. And people are like, it's like, why did you pull in this like 20-line code file from somewhere else? Like, just rewrite it yourself, right? Don't have this kind of like silly extra dangerous dependency, right? So just going through all these things, and is important for any project to constantly look over their dependencies, and discourage folks from pulling in dangerous or small software packages that could easily be rewritten. And it's getting even further. We've been working on stuff even like SBOMs or cryptography bill of materials for quantum security. This is really, I think, critical for the future of security is just all of these bill of materials and paying attention to dependencies and everything like that. I had a great conversation with Greg Crow-Hartman, who's one of the leaders of the kernel, about some of this stuff recently. And it's kind of wild. How many CVEs do you think the kernel gets over some period of time? I'm just curious. I'm not going to tell you the period of time.
I'd say at least a couple million, like a month or so, or no?
So right now it's about 13 a day. CVEs.
Oh, CVEs. Gotcha.
Yeah. So that's a lot. They're obviously, varying in terms of severity. But as we get sort of better and better, best security practices for coding, and developers become more security aware, sort of the incidental and accidental bugs that are critically severe go down. So it incentivizes people to do these more, software supply chain attacks.
Yeah, well, I would even add on, especially since blockchains, they're not directly competing with each other, but when it comes to what's our downtime, it's very much a competing factor for marketing the chain. And even having one incident for a DDoS or DOS attack, it can have a big thing, because there was one guy, or we had a DDoS attack, I think, last year, and someone was trying to do cents transactions to fill blocks for like 400K, and it did like minimal interruption. So I can only imagine what the kernel is dealing with.
I mean, we haven't seen any like really devastating supply chain attacks on blockchains, to my knowledge, yet. And we joke about this. I told Greg maybe he's just a long-term foreign state agent, and he's going to embed a bug in the kernel. Yeah.
Well, when you're talking SBOM attacks or CBOMs, NPM is.
Oh yeah.
That could have been a potential thing. Because shout out to Christian Grabmeyer, but last podcast episode we were talking about Log4j and how that turned into the shell incident. So it was really cool to see the learning experiences from that, and how they became a staple for ensuring sustainability became a topic.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a classic example of one of these kind of attacks.
Yeah. Well, so I did want to talk on one emerging topic that's coming about, which is there's when you're talking about decentralized governance and setting up municipal governments and stuff, I've seen new interesting points about whether foundations are relevant or not, if you should go for a DAO structure or everything autonomous. Obviously, we're doing the foundation examples. And I think that helps, especially at least when you need a decentralized environment with kind of a arm to help push things along that isn't owned by anyone. So I think that's where foundations are needed. Maybe DAOs help with that too. But what are your thoughts on?
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, there's not a hard distinction between like a DAO and a foundation, right? You could, in theory, automate all your voting and governance and everything like that, and just turn it into a DAO. Um, you know, I guess for more mature organizations, the complications of doing that on chain are a little bit much for what's present right now, right?
Mhm.
Um, you know, there aren't necessarily good solutions right now where people, you're not going to be able to convince like foundation employees that that they should take salary from sort of on-chain mechanisms, right? Um, you'd certainly need a privacy-preserving way to handle money. It gets complicated, right? So, in the long run, we said that everything would be tokenized, right? In the long run, all this stuff might be managed by some kind of decentralized system anyway. So in that case, like, what's the difference, between a DAO and a foundation? Um, you know, the foundation is going to have a lot more like fail safes and other things than a DAO, but a complicated DAO, you could certainly build those in too, right? Um, so, I think you have to, if you want to separate these two, you have to carefully define like what a DAO and a foundation are, because in some sense they're both the same thing. If you're structuring them for blockchain governance.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's centralization is done on a spectrum, and there's different
Absolutely.
ways of it. And then foundations are very much far right on the decentralization aspect. And then autonomous voting is just like that one click over, maybe from that.
Yeah,
Um,
it's I'm not sure necessarily, right? Foundations vary widely in terms of decentralization. Some foundations are very decentralized and some are quite centralized, right? Um, you know, if you look at the LF and who's on the board of the LF and who, wields what power, I would claim it's extremely decentralized, right? Um, there's no one company that
yeah.
controls that much in the LF, right? Obviously some foundations are much more centralized. Uh, but the same can be said for DAOs, right? If you're assuming DAO governance is based on some resource, whether that's a token or whatever, that could be very centralized or decentralized too. So I don't think centralization is necessarily, inherent in the structure. There's a wide continuum for both of these.
No, clarify that there is some supporting metrics, but at least in the intent when people try to set it up, that's kind of the mission behind it. At least in the open source world. But yeah, there are foundations that are very centralized, claiming to be decentralized. They're kind of self-explanatory on their own.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
but to that, the reason I was asking that is because it's a lot of questions on like, especially in initiatives like ours. Why are we doing it this way? It's because push comes to shove, these mechanisms could be there in a couple years, but I think you still need that human factor. And it's kind of like conversation I was having with someone where they think open source is going to change because of vibe coding. Um, but if you forecast a couple years and you remove human elements, that means AI is only referencing stuff that AI wrote, and the innovation kind of stops in a way in the long term. If that's the only thing that happens, you still need a human factor for coordinating all these different pieces. So I don't think we're going to be full robots, but maybe we get there. Don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing is not just human, but legal. Um,
That too. Yeah, regulatory.
if you're putting together these things, right, people want, companies particularly want to rely on something that is well grounded legally. Um, and this will probably change in the future, but right now, like DAOs with fully anonymous participation are a tough sell for companies. Um, you know, uh, it's who's governing this, right? And how do I know? And if something goes wrong, like what lawyer can I talk to, kind of thing, right? So, I would say if you're like a traditional finance organization, and you say, hey, we want to participate in this organization, it's a fully autonomous DAO, you have to go to your legal team. And this is probably some, like not necessarily young person who, may not know about blockchain, definitely doesn't know the details. And they're going to look at this and they're going to be like, absolutely not. We're not participating in this, right? So there's some, legal and governance and just, cultural stuff, right? The technologists at a lot of companies, even in traditional industries are familiar with blockchain and how it works and the benefits. But progress hasn't necessarily been made to the legal departments yet. So that's why, governance, full DAO governance can be a hard sell.
Well, I guess it's the whole conversation about permissionless blockchain too. When it came to regulatory stuff, we're making the transition. Maybe this stuff will be there, but to your point, especially with legal things, I think that's like a 20-year hurdle. At least from, maybe I can be wrong. Someone feel free to quote me on that. I don't mind. But
there are public blockchains that do have like, good and free and transparent governance, right? But it's generally, like who spends the money and how is the money spent? There's like a process, or there are like individuals who are known to decide this, right?
Well, and the other thing too is if someone's going to entrust their source code to someone, it's easier with the foundation because there's levels to participate, help steward things, because letting things go completely is a hard sell for people a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Well, I know we're coming up on close to time. So for anyone aspiring in the world of open source and or Web3, you could do a point to either. What would you say the basic starting points are and a lesson learned that you can give back to them?
So I'll start with the lesson learned. A lesson learned is don't be shy. And a starting point is just dive in. A good community will be welcoming and open to new contributors. They'll be happy to have you help, join meetings, talk to people, obviously like read the instructions, don't just, shoot a big PR before you, look at the contributing guidelines. But, in general, dive right in, don't be afraid to ask questions, and, participate. And if an organization is not friendly to you asking questions or looking to get involved, it's probably not one that you want to participate in. So, I'll say, to reiterate, don't be shy, ask questions and dive in.
Well, I think that's a good point too. If someone's extended a dinner invitation to everyone and anyone can come, but they did highlight that there's a dress code, you probably want to adhere to it to not embarrass yourself. So that's good.
Check the invite. Yeah.
Last question. What is something that you're willing to disclose that not many people know about you?
About me that people don't know. I guess it depends on people. One fun fact is I used to be a competitive swimmer. So I swam for many years of my life. Enjoyed it. I probably need to get back into it so I can, make my doctors happy and lose a little bit of weight. That's one fun fact.
Won any awards with it?
I did, yeah. Another fun fact, I enjoy scuba diving when I can, although that is less common these days.
Have you run into any exciting creatures while scuba diving?
Many exciting creatures.
Any coming after you, or?
No, nothing's attacked me. I've seen a bunch of sharks.
Oh, cool.
So that's always fun.
I'm assuming that was off somewhere near San Francisco, or
No, I haven't done a lot of scuba diving here. The water's very cold.
yeah, I went to I forgot the city's name with the starts with a D, but they have the is it the Jack in the Box or the Taco Bell right next to the ocean? And you
Yes.
literally can't see anything in the morning, and it's super cold and frigid.
Yep, Pacifica, right there.
Yeah, there we go.
It's the prettiest Taco Bell in the world.
Yeah, 100% love that place.
It
But
actually issues with people doing engagement photos at that Taco Bell because it's so pretty.
no kidding. That's cool.
Yeah.
I've only been there twice. If anyone's wondering, Dorito Loco Tacos, 3 Supreme, large diet Pepsi. Compensate for the fat. That's my advice.
Yeah.
But thank you, Hart, for always making time for me, for the audience in general. We appreciate your insights, your experience. Maybe we'll bring you back again in the future as different things proceed. But thank you for coming.
Yeah, always great to chat. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah. And hopefully I'll catch you sometime and we can go swimming. Because I am terrible and I'm better as a belly flop than anything else. So
I'm sure I'll see you in the not too distant future. Thanks a lot, Christian.
okay. Yep. Thank you. Let me figure out how to stop a recording. There we go.